friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using this adorable set from Mama Elephant called Flower Shower. So I've stamped my images out on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. And I will be coloring with my Copic markers, but first I wanted to choose a piece of pattern paper to match my coloring to. So I'm using one from this summer collection from Cartabella. I wanted to use one of these floral prints, but the first one was too large in scale. It would have competed with the flowers in the image. The second one had too much white space since you'll only see a little bit of it in the final card. This third one I thought was perfect. So I'm just going to tuck that under the edge of my little cardstock panel and we can jump into the coloring. So the first critter I'm going to tackle is this cute little bunny, and I decided to do him in some warm grays. I wanted each of these critters to have a distinct look, so I wanted to use a very different color palette for each of them. So I picked the warm grays for this guy, and I'm using W00, W1, and W3. First going in with that W3 and laying in a little shadow any place that I feel that it should go, and then I'm going to start to blend that out with the W1. I want him to look more like a white bunny or a super pale gray bunny, so I'm trying to keep those darkest colors really close to the outer edge and leave a lot of space for the highlight. So then I'm going to come in with that W00 and begin to blend out the W1. I am going to let that fade off into the white on the lower part of his face and also on his belly. So I'm not going to cover completely, and then he'll have just that really soft look. Then I'm going to move on to my kitty, and he's going to be a little yellow tiger cat. So I'm starting with Y21 and Y26. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go a little bit darker with him or a little bit lighter, so I decided to kind of start in the middle. I laid down a little bit of that Y21 first, but decided I needed a bit more definition, so I went in quickly with the Y26 and laid in my shadows with that. Then I'll go back to my Y21 and start to blend that out. I decided that the Y26 would be my darkest, and then the Y21 is going to be a mid-tone. So I'm going to pull in some lighter colors here in just a minute. Forgot to shade in that one little arm, so I went back and did that quickly. And then I will grab the Y11. So I'm going to add a little bit of more of a brighter yellow tone in here, although it is a pale one, so I think it works with these shades, and start to blend toward the center. But I realized I needed an even lighter tone so that it kind of matches the same definition that I have on the bunny where I let it fade into the white. So I used Y000 for that. I'm going to let him dry before I come back in and do his stripes, but in the meantime, I thought I would color in the centers of my flowers, and I'm just using those darkest three shades for that. So I started with the Y26, blending out with the Y21 as the midtone, and then the Y11 for the highlight. Now that my kitty has dried a bit, I'm going to come in with the YR23 and add in his little tiger stripes. If you would do this before the ink has had a chance to dry a little bit, the color might disperse and you wouldn't get as crisp lines. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I'm just going to draw in those little triangle shapes. I did them across his forehead, and now I'm coming down the right-hand side of his body. Of course, I need to add a few to his tail, so that matches as well. And then I wanted to add just a few over on the left-hand side, but I'm going to make those shorter because we're not seeing as much of that side of his body as we are on the right. And then I did add just a couple little tiny triangles to his paws, so he's got those little tiger stripes all over. For the dog, I decided to go with some E40s. I picked E41, E42, and E43 for his body. So I'm starting with that E43 and laying in some shadows. Now he has equal shadows on both the left and the right because he's facing completely forward. So I just kind of outlined his body and added a little shadow around that flower stem. And then I'm blending that out with the E42. I'm going to skip over his ears because I'm going to come back and do those in a different color so that he has more of like a two-tone look to him. And then I'm going to blend out with the E41. And then I decided, same as with the other characters, I just needed a fourth shade to really soften him up in the center. So I grabbed the E40 for that. And then for his other parts, I'm just going to go a step darker. I'm going to actually hang on to that E43 and add in the E44 and the E47 for his ears. I'm using the E47 on the underside so that the highlight will be on the top. I'm also going to color in those little tufts of hair on the top of his head and give him a little spot on one of his paws. So I'm going to blend that out with the E44, and then I'll come back with that E43 for the highlight. Just color in the rest of those little tufts, and then I'll add just a tiny bit to the outside edge of that spot so it kind of fades into the rest of him. I'll grab that E47 and color in his nose. For the other two critters, I wanted them to have a pink nose, so I used R20 for that. And then I'm going to give them some rosy cheeks by doing a little oval shape with the R20 and the R11, just adding that R20 first, and then going around it with the R11. And I'm not sure why I skipped over the dog. I guess maybe just because I was already doing the noses on those two. And the inside of their ears, that I just forgot to give the little dog rosy cheeks. So I guess I can still go back and add them in even though the card is finished now. But anyway, I'm going to add in the R22 and I'm going to use these shades to color in the flower that the bunny is holding. And I'm actually going to start with my lightest shade first, the R11, and kind of flick that color onto each of those petals, making sure to get all of the ones that are kind of tucked under the others as well, so everything has a little bit of that pale pink. And then I'm going to jump straight into my darkest shade, the R22, and start to add a bit of that in as well. Just doing those tiny little flicking motions so I get really thin little lines, and it kind of disperses as it gets toward the end of each petal. So it'll have like a nice fade into the lighter pink that I'll be adding. So I've got my R22 all laid in, and then I'll grab my mid-tone, the R20, and just pull that color out a bit, just in that same motion, just grabbing the end of the R22 and pulling it down each of those petals, but still saving a bit of white space at the end for my highlight. So then I'll grab that R11 once again and just finish off each of those petals. I didn't bring it like completely covering. I did leave just a little bit of white on each of those petals as well, just to help that really have, you know, more dimension. And then I decided to go back to my R22 one more time and just add a little bit extra to deepen up those darkest areas, because I'm going to have two pink flowers on this card and I just wanted there to be enough of a variation between them. So that one I was pulling from that darker pink, and then the next one that I'm doing, I'm going to do a bit of a lighter pink. I'm going to keep the R11 and the R20. The R20 is going to become my darkest. And then I'm going to add in the R00 for my highlight shade. So I'm doing the same thing again, just doing a light wash with my lightest shade, the R00 first, and then jumping straight to my darkest, the R20, and doing that same flicking motion and adding that bit of depth to those petals. Then I'll take the R11 and start to pull that color further down, but I'm leaving a lot of white space on the end of this one because I really want it to be nice and light when we get to those ends. So I'll grab that R00 and pull that color almost all the way to the end, once again leaving a little bit of white space to give it that bit of a glow at the tips. And then, just like I did with the other one, I'm going to go back to my darkest shade, the R20, and add a bit more of that just to create even more contrast. Even though the coloring is pale, there still can be contrast, and that's going to make the image really pop. So I just went over that with a second layer of all of those shades because this one needed to be a bit more smoothed out since the petals are a lot broader. And then I am going to go and color in the little tiny petals around the center with the R00, but I'm going to change that up later on. My third flower is going to be blue, and I wanted it to be something similar to those dusty blue rose type flowers that you see in that pattern paper. So I chose BG 000, B41, and B45. So I started with the wash of the BG 000 first to lay in a little bit of color, and now I'm coming in with that B45 and adding in a little bit of darkness. And I like to color my flowers typically with the darkest color toward the center, but it could be cool to do the darkest colors at the tips and get lighter at the center. I think that would be really pretty too. This is just my go-to, but I think it would be really pretty both ways. So I blended out the B45 with the B41, and then I'm coming up from the ends with the BG 000 and just coloring that in. And I didn't get a really smooth blend because there is quite a bit of difference between the B41 and the B45. So I went back in with that B41, but I'm picking up a little bit of the B45 using the tip to tip motion to just kind of smooth that out and, you know, get a nicer blend there so it's not so streaky. And then I blended that out with the BG 000 one more time, and it still wasn't completely as smooth as I wanted it, so I decided to just embrace it and go back with that B45 and make the streakiness look intentional. So I'm going to add some really thin little feathery strokes so that it looks almost like veining in those petals. And I actually think that came out really nice. I just went back with a touch of that BG 000. And I also went over the tiny little petals on the pink flower with the blue just to kind of tie it into the blue flower so they were a little bit more cohesive. For the stems, I'm going to use G43 and G46, just the two shades because the area is so super tiny there. So I'm adding the G46 on the front of each stem where it's bent forward. So that would be cast in more shadow because that big heavy blossom would keep it from getting the sun. And then I'm going to blend the opposite side with the G43. And I'm just holding my marker very straight up and down so I can get those nice thin lines and stay, you know, in that area and not go outside. So I'm going to add in the G26 and use these three shades to color the shell of my turtle. So I use the G28 down at the bottom and a tiny bit at the back. And then I'm blending up with the G46 and finishing with the G43. And then for his head and feet, I wanted to have something that would contrast. So I picked a much more yellow-green. I went with YG01, YG03, and YG05. So I just used the YG05 first, and then the YG03, and then the YG01 for the highlight. I went back to my R11 and R20 to give him a rosy cheek. So everybody except the dog got one. And then I'm going to go in with BG11 and BG13 for the 3 puddles. I used the BG13 first to add a little definition on the edges, just kind of here and there, wherever I thought it looked nice. And then I'll blend that out with the BG11. I am going to need a 3rd shade, so I'm going to grab the BG10 and fill in all the rest of that white space in the center of each of those little puddles. I'll grab my black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and go over the eyes of each of my critters to make them nice and bright and shiny. Just kind of bring them a little bit more to life. And then I'm going to grab a white Sakura Jelly Roll pen and add a little bit of shine to the water. It wasn't coming out great, so the lines aren't very crisp, but it does add a little bit of something. I probably think I need a new pen. This one is pretty old, so that could be the issue. But anyway, once I have those drawn in, I'm going to trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm taking a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock and using the Lawn Fawn Cloudy Stencil to blend on some Distress Oxide ink. And I'm starting with the color Stormy Sky, which is very appropriate because I am creating a stormy sky scene. So I'm going to blend that on at the top, and then I'm going to just shift that stencil and turn it into a different direction so I get a different cloud formation, and then I will continue blending on that ink. I wanted to kind of soften up that stormy sky though and get another color in there, so I'm going to grab some tumbled glass as well and blend that toward the top edge of those clouds and kind of get that dreamy look that I'm trying to go for here. Then I'm going to turn my stencil once again and repeat this one more time. So I'll just pick out one more cloud formation that is, you know, in a different variation than the previous one. So, you know, I don't want to have like the taller clouds always on the same part of the scene. And then go in with that stormy sky and then the tumbled glass once again. And then for the bottom, I'm just going to swipe on a little bit of color there. It's going to end up getting covered up in the card anyway, but I always just like to cover up that blank whiteness at the bottom just in case any of it ends up showing, but it definitely won't on this one. I'm going to smoosh both of those colors onto my Waffle Flower Mini Media Mat and add a little bit of water to those, and then I'll pick those up with a thin paintbrush. I actually started with just some of the plain water so I could get some little white droplets, and I'll use a paper towel to blot that up so that it kind of lifts that ink away. And then I'll go in with my other 2 shades. I'm going to do the lighter one first, the tumbled glass, and that way I don't have to clean my paintbrush in between. And I know I got a little bit of water in that top corner, but I'm going to be cutting this panel down a bit, so it really won't matter. I'm going to splatter on that stormy sky next, and then I decided I wanted to have a little bit of glitter. So I'm going to grab my Lawn Fawn liquid Stardust. You have to shake that up really good because all of that sparkle does settle down to the bottom. It is very yellow toned though, and I wanted to see if I could kind of tint it a little bit more silver. So I added in a bit of that Stormy Sky Distress Oxide ink, and it absolutely worked. It really gave it more of like a silvery or metallic kind of glitter, and I think that works a lot better with this scene that I'm creating. Then I cut down 2 more pieces of Bristol with the MFT Grassy Hills Dynamics so I could have 2 grassy borders. and I'm going to try an ink combination that I've never tried before. My usual go-to is Twisted Citron and then Mowed Lawn to darken it up. I wanted to go with something a bit darker today, so I'm going to start with the Mowed Lawn. And I'm going to blend that on to each of these little strips, and I'm laying that down pretty heavily up at the grass line and then kind of letting it fade to white at the bottom. I am going to cover up that white space in just a minute, but I just wanted there to be a little less ink on my ink blending tool when I did that. So I will go over that now and just use whatever is left on that tool to blend the rest of the way down so it's a little bit of a softer color. And then I'm going to grab a nice dark shade. I'm going to use Lucky Clover. It has a little bit of a blue tone to it, so I think it works well with this darker stormy background. So I'm going to blend that on to the grass line again. I'll do that on both of these strips, and then I will go back to my Mowed Lawn blending tool and blend the transition so that it gets nice and smooth and it's more of like an ombre look. I don't know what I got on the bottom of that one, but I'm going to splatter these pretty heavily as well, so hopefully it won't show later on. And I think it ends up getting covered up by a critter anyway. I knew I wanted a critter near that placement, so I wasn't too worried about it. So I'm going to smoosh both of those, and again start with my lightest color first, that way I don't have to clean off my paintbrush in between, and do some nice splatter detail and get that all nice and covered with different size droplets. And then I'll go in to my Lucky Clover and just repeat that same process, and then I'll set all of these panels off to the side to dry. Once they were, I trimmed them down with the MFT A2 Stitch Rectangle Stacks Set 2, and I used the second smallest die in that little die set. So I'm going to layer these up on the card. I'm going to start by layering the two grassy borders together and getting those kind of placed how I want them, and then I'll glue both of those together onto my background. So I'll just add a bit more of that liquid glue and then make sure that the bottom corners are perfectly lined up so it's on there nice and straight. Then I'm going to pop this into my MISTI so that I can stamp my sentiment, and I'm using one from that same stamp set, and I'm stamping it down with VersaFine Onyx Blank ink. I find that this ink lays over the Distress Oxides the best. A lot of other inks kind of fade into the oxide, or the oxide kind of comes up over it and gives a cloudy look, but this one is nice and bold on top, so it's my go-to for these type of backgrounds. Then I'll pop my card base in my MISTI. I want to stamp on the inside and finish off the card so that it gives the recipient something unexpected on the inside. So I'm using a piece of Lawn Fawn apricot cardstock that I've scored and folded to a standard A2 size card. So it is 4 1/4 tall by 5 1/2 wide, and I'm stamping in Peachy Keen ink, and I use the little chick and another one of the sentiments with the raindrop and the small little puddle. So now I'm ready to add my pattern papers, and I've just cut that down and use the back side as my contrasting pattern. I trimmed those both down with the Lawn Fawn large stitch rectangle stackables. So I'm going to adhere the floral print down first, and I just turned that upside down because I liked the colors that were at the other side a little bit more. I wanted those yellows at the top because they just look nice and happy. And then I'll glue the other piece down, and I even use the part that has the little hole cut into it because once I get my focal panel over top you'll never even see that, so I didn't end up wasting any of that sheet of pattern paper. I've added some foam tape to the back of my focal panel to give it a little bit of lift on the card, and I'm going to pop that down in the center. I'm just using the grid on that blue and white checked pattern paper to make sure that's on there nice and straight. Then I'll bring in my images, and I'm going to start with the bunny. So I'm going to add a little bit more liquid glue to the back of her, and I'm going to add her over on the left hand side of the scene down toward the bottom. And while she is still wet, before I've pressed her down firmly, I wanted to tuck this largest puddle under her upraised foot. So I'm just going to tuck that under there and then go ahead and press that down into place. And then I wanted to do the opposite side of the card next. So I get everything spaced correctly, and then the same with her. I'm not going to press her down too firmly because I want to tuck the second largest puddle under her foot. Once I have her tilted just the way I want her, I can grab my little dog, and he's going to go in the center, and I just want to place him so that he's raised up a little bit more and taking up some of that space in the top of the card so that it draws your eye toward that sentiment and it just doesn't look so empty up there. Then I'll grab the smaller little puddle and place that between the larger two, just trying to fill in some more of that space in the center of the card. And then finally I have my little turtle, and he's going to be kind of crawling toward that larger puddle that the bunny is stepping in because he's ready to take a little swim. I adjusted that smaller puddle just a little bit to the right. And now I'm ready to add my favorite embellishment, Stardust Stickles. I'm not going to go too crazy on this card because I don't want to cover up too much of the coloring. I'm going to add it to the centers of each of the flowers and a little bit to each of the puddles. Just trying not to cover up that white gel pen because it will dissolve. So kind of working around that and just adding a little bit so it gives it that bit of sparkle. I'll lift that up to the camera so you can see all of that detail and how that catches the light. And then I'll give you another peek at the inside. I had so much fun playing with these adorable critters today. I really hope that you enjoyed this one too. If you did, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. If you're interested in the products I used, you'll find them listed and linked in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day. Bye-bye.